introduce our next speaker. Dr. Aaron Heap comes to us via Oklahoma. He did his undergraduate work at the University of Texas Christian, and he got his PhD at the University of Houston. He came to us via postgraduate work at the University of Rochester, and now he's an associate professor of mathematics at the State University of New York at Geneseo. Anybody here from Geneseo? Student? Awesome. Okay. He received the Faculty Advisor Award for Excellence. Let's see, what does it say here? I'm sorry, I lost my spot. Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Teaching at SUNY Geneseo. So he's going to give you tonight an excellent teaching entitled Mathematics of an Infinite God. Let's welcome Dr. Aaron Heap.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to Agape Christian Fellowship for hosting this event and for inviting us to speak here. And of course, thanks to all of you for showing up, sacrificing your free time and your evening to be here with us. It certainly means a lot to us to have you guys show up. Veritas Exchange, the purpose of our group and the purpose of this series of lectures is to provide to you guys scientific, historical, philosophical reasons for justifying belief in Jesus Christ, to defend the existence of God, and to defend the reliability of the Bible. Now, while the existence of God or the non-existence of God cannot be proved using science or mathematics, there's still plenty of evidence out there, scientific evidence, historical evidence, that supports the reliability of Scripture, supports the existence of God. And so we're just trying to impart some of this information to you so that you can make your own decision, as Professor Ortenzi said. Make your own decisions about what you believe. Now, I do apologize that as a mathematician, I'm nowhere near as entertaining as Professor Ortenzi. So I am by nature a geeky, boring person. So I apologize for the lack of entertainment during this next 30 minutes. But hopefully, at least you will enjoy the things that I have to say to you. Because I want to bring you to a place where the supernatural meets the mathematical, by seeing how we can use mathematics to understand God a little bit better, and what it would be like for God to interact with us in our three-dimensional universe. So, I was raised in a Christian home. I've always been a believer in Jesus Christ as long as I can remember. But there was a time when I was going through college, when I was going through graduate school and was learning more and more science and mathematics, that doubts began to come in to my heart and into my mind. As a mathematician, I don't like miracles occurring. So this question of, is God real? Are the stories that I've learned about, read about in the Bible, are those true? Can those actually have happened? Especially when it comes to miracles. You know, that question of, is this real, caused a true internal struggle in my mind. And it's something that I had to get figured out. It's something that I had to explore more. But the more I learned, the more I studied, the more science and math that I learned, I came to two important conclusions in my life. First is that miracles are in fact explainable. Not from a naturalistic point of view, a naturalistic explanation that takes the miraculousness out of the miracle. But instead, I applied a mathematical perspective to my view of God. And it actually showed me that miracles can be explained. And the second point is that no matter what our worldview actually is, everyone believes in miracles. Now that second point is kind of what Professor Ortenzi was trying to get us to see. No matter what approach we are taking to explaining this world, whether it's naturalism or religion, it's a miracle that we are here today. life exists. And so no matter what, people do believe in miracles. Now, because of our time restrictions, I'm not going to have time to attack both of these. Professor Tinsey did a pretty good job with that second one, and I'm sure that you can ask both of us some questions about that during the Q&A section. My focus for tonight is going to be on this first point. And I want to give us an understanding of how mathematics can be used to explain God, and how it can explain how that God can perform these miracles. And what I learned in my own studies is that mathematics gives us a glimpse of the awesome power of God, and a glimpse of the awesome character of God. And I just want to share that with you a little bit tonight. So how is it that we can explain how God interacts with us and communicates with us? And how can He do these miracles that we read about in the Bible or hear about in the world? So let's start with, what is a miracle? Well, C.S. Lewis gives us this definition of a miracle, which I really like. A miracle is a form of doctoring or tampering. It introduces a new factor into the situation, namely a supernatural force, which the scientists have not reckoned on. Its cause is the activity of God, and its result according to natural law. In calling them miracles, we do not mean that they are contradictions or outrages. We mean that, left to her own resources, nature could never produce them. An example of this would be if I take some three-dimensional object like this bottle of water, and I let it go. If this remains suspended in air by an act of God, that is definitely a miracle. However, it does not violate the law of gravity, because the law of gravity does not say that this object will fall to the ground. The law of gravity says that this object will fall to the ground unless something interrupts its descent. I can easily stop this from falling to the ground by just sticking out my hand and catching it. I haven't violated the law of gravity in doing so. What makes it a miracle is the fact that God was the one doing the intervening. He was the one interfering with that descent. So we're not talking about contradicting natural law. We're saying God intervenes, and the result of this is not a contradiction. Okay, so there is our view of what a miracle is. Now let's bring mathematics into the discussion. My field of research as a mathematician is topology. It's essentially the study of shapes and spaces. And as a topologist, throughout my work, I have to study objects of various dimensions, including 4 dimensions and higher. So I want to give us try to give us an understanding of what dimensions are, and I want to get an idea of what higher dimensions look like by studying first lower dimensions. So first, what is a dimension? We can think of dimensions as independent, perpendicular directions in which we are allowed to move. For 0 dimensions, this means I cannot move in any direction. So I'm standing here, I can't move anywhere. I'm stuck in a single point. So a point is 0 dimensional. For 1 dimension, I have 1 direction in which I can move. Maybe we can call it side to side or east and west. But I'm only in 1 dimension, so I can only move in a linear fashion. Now I want to add a second dimension to this. If east and west is the first dimension, we're going to call north and south the second dimension. It's perpendicular to the original one, so it's independent from the original one. And, geometrically, once we get the second dimension, we have a plane. I've got this entire stage. I can move forward and backward. I can move side to side, and any combination of those to get the other directions. So we have a plane. Now, this screen is 2-dimensional. The projection that we see on here is 2-dimensional. I'm going to pretend, for the sake of this talk, that this screen has no thickness to it. Okay? So we have a 2-dimensional screen here. And I need to figure out a way to get 3 dimensions. It has to be perpendicular to the original too, but I cannot fit 3 dimensions into this 2-dimensional universe. I cannot fit it into this screen. Out here, we have 3 dimensions. We have north and south, assuming that's north and south. I don't actually know what direction I'm facing. We have east and west, but we also have up and down. So we can easily add a 3rd dimension out here. But in this screen, I can't do it. It would have to come out of the screen towards you. That would be the 3rd dimension we're adding. Well, we're going to call this 3rd dimension up and down. Now, again, I can't fit I can't fit this bottle of water into this screen. It won't fit. This has thickness to it, the screen doesn't. But I can imitate thickness in this screen. I can project a three-dimensional object into the screen by showing you things like a photograph, for example. Or I can do a perspective drawing, something that will imitate 3 dimensions. And so that's what we'll do in the second, or in this next slide. So we've added the up and down dimension. It's perpendicular to the original 2. And objects in 3 dimensions, easy to visualize, easy to understand, because this is life as we know it. These are the things that we interact with. We, ourselves, are 3-dimensional. But how do I get a 4th dimension? I've got to add a direction that is perpendicular to the original 3. I cannot do it here in 3-dimensional space. Just like I couldn't add a 3rd dimension into that screen. Okay, so we cannot fit a 4th dimension into our 3-dimensional space, but that does not mean we can't visualize it. It doesn't mean we can't understand it and study it. Just like we can visualize 3-dimensional objects on this screen, we can actually visualize 4-dimensional objects out here. Okay? But that 4th dimension doesn't actually exist in our 3-dimensional space. Now, some of you have been trained to say, well, let's consider that 4th dimension to be time. And that's certainly a good way to do it. It leads to some good understanding. So I can give you an example of how to do this. I've got a 3-dimensional object here. Now, what I want you to do is keep track of where this object is as it moves through time. Okay, so just memorize every location that this object is as I'm moving it through time. The end result of this, if you're memorizing all of those positions, that's a 4-dimensional object. Okay? So we can visualize 4-dimensional things, but we are not going to use time as our 4th dimension. We are referring to a physical dimension, a spatial dimension, not a time dimension. And they do behave differently. For example, in a spatial dimension, I can go forward and backward. I cannot do that in a time dimension. I cannot go back in time. Okay, so these do have different attributes to them. So we're not using time as our 4th dimension. I'm actually referring to a spatial, physical, a physical dimension, not a time dimension. Now I said that we can actually visualize 4-dimensional objects out here, so I want to attempt to do that. I want to illustrate how we can build a 4-dimensional object, and I'm going to do this by constructing what I call a 4-dimensional cube. It's also known as a hypercube or a tesseract. We're going to start this by starting in the lowest possible dimension, starting with 0 dimensions. So I begin with a 0-dimensional cube, which is just a point, and I can create a 1-dimensional cube by taking a copy of the 0-dimensional cube and then connect the corresponding points with a line segment. So I started with the 0-dimensional cube, I built the 1-dimensional cube. We know it as a line segment. Now I'm going to use that same recipe to build a 2-dimensional cube, which we know is called a square. So I take a copy of my 1-dimensional cube, and then I connect the corresponding points with line segments. And now we can construct a 3-dimensional cube. I take a copy of my 2-dimensional cube, there it is, and then I connect the corresponding points, and we now have a cube. Now keep in mind, that cube, I've projected it onto a screen. It doesn't actually live in 2 dimensions. We can see self-intersections. We can see places where the red square in the back intersects the blue square in the front. Okay, so this is not actually living in 2 dimensions, but we can imitate depth by giving a perspective drawing. But to create a 4-dimensional cube, to create a hypercube, all I have to do is follow the same recipe. Make a copy of this. There it is. Now it looks smaller, but that's just to give you guys some depth, some perspective. The 2 cubes are the same size. One's just further in the background. Okay? So I make a copy of the 3 cube, and then I connect the corresponding points, and there is a 4-dimensional hypercube.
Cool.
I can set this thing in motion and look at it from different perspectives. So this is the 4 cube, the hypercube, as it's moving around, and we're looking at it from different points of view. Okay? But this isn't actually the 4 cube, right? This is a projection of the 4 cube into the screen. In fact, it's into a 2-dimensional universe that I have placed this hypercube, because the screen is 2-dimensional. But this is what it would look like. Now, I basically put this in there just to hypnotize you in some sort of way, so that you'll believe everything that I'm about to say next. Because what I'm about to say next is when things start getting a little more complicated. Okay, so while this hypercube looks really cool, somewhat mesmerizing, it gives us a way to visualize four-dimensional objects in our three-dimensional universe. It's not the point of my talk. My point is not to get you to understand what four dimensions looks like. My point of this talk, and my goal for this talk, is to get you to see how a higher dimensional being, God, views us in three dimensions. Not how we can view four dimensions, but how does four dimensions view us? And that's what we want to do next. So, when I was in school and I was trying to study the geometry of four-dimensional shapes, I really struggled with that. And my advisor at the time said, well, why don't you read this book called Flatland? And I don't know if some of you may have read Flatland, a couple of you, but those of you who haven't, it's basically a story about a flat universe, a two-dimensional universe called Flatland. And this book describes how we would see, how we would visualize two-dimensional space. What surprised me is that as I was reading this, I realized, well, my advisor was right. I could understand four-dimensional geometry better after reading this book. But the more surprising thing is not only could I understand four dimensions better, I could understand God better, and I could understand how God interacts with us. And those doubts about the Bible and miracles and all of these things that were causing the struggle in my life at that time, they started to go away because I now can see how God does things. And this is what I'm going to present to you guys tonight, is give you a way of understanding how God interacts with us. And that's through this two-dimensional universe called Flatland. So, what I want us to do is, excuse me, I want us to pretend that we're losing the up and down dimension. Okay, we're not in three dimensions anymore. We only have east and west and north and south. So on this screen, east and west is obvious, that's side to side. North and south is going to be up and down on the screen. Okay, but we don't have that third dimension. There's no vertical dimension. There's no up and down in this universe. Now, what do the people in Flatland look like? Well, let's think about what we look like. Okay, if I look at you, I see the exteriors of your body. I see your front. You see the front of me right now, but you can't see the back of me. You can't see all of me at once. Okay, but I can certainly see you, parts of you at any given time. Now, what about this picture? This is a three-dimensional person. It's a picture of a three-dimensional person. How do we know that it's three-dimensional, not two-dimensional? We call it two-dimensional graphics. It's a very poor quality cartoon, but this is a three-dimensional person. Look at his eyes. His eyes are between his head and us. His clothes are between his body and us. That means there's depth to this picture. That means there is a third dimension. These things are stacked. You can think of them as being stacked out of that screen. His clothes are between us and his body. So there's depth to it, and this represents a three-dimensional person. So what about in Flatland? Well, when two-dimensional people look at each other, they see the outsides of their bodies. When one Flatlander is looking at another Flatlander, they see the front, but they can't see their back. They can't see the whole body at once. Okay, when we're looking at our three-dimensional people, we see a two-dimensional skin wrapped around a three-dimensional body. But Flatlanders, they also have skin that separates the inside of their body from the outside, but they don't have three-dimensional bodies. Their universe is flat. So they have a one-dimensional skin around their two-dimensional bodies. Okay? So everything has to drop down a dimension. But what do we see as we look into their universe? What do we see as we look into Flatland? We see exactly that. We see a one-dimensional skin around a two-dimensional body. Notice that this guy, I can see his back and his front at the same time. I can see his entire body. We can't do that in three dimensions. Okay? But we can see his entire body here. We can also see his internal organs. We can see the inside of his body. We can see what he ate for lunch. Now, I do have to confess, that's a really bad picture. Because that's a three-dimensional pizza, not a two-dimensional piece of pizza. The pepperoni is between us and the cross. Okay, so that's a really bad joke because it's mathematically wrong, not because it's not funny. I'm trying here, guys. Come on. So we can see our internal organs. I can see his outside, his inside, his front, his back, all at once. Now, I want to make this a little bit easier. So instead of having people that actually look like people, I'm going to make them look like geometric shapes, because that's what we do in math. We try to simplify things with geometry. I mentioned earlier there's this book called Flatland, and it was written in the late 1800s. But in the early 2000s, I think it was about 10 years ago, they made it into some movies. And these are the characters from that movie, from both movies. And I want to use these to do my illustrations tonight just because they're easier to work with. But again, it's the same thing. If I look at that big square in the middle, he's got a one-dimensional skin around his two-dimensional body. We can see his internal organs. We can see his front and back all at the same time. Now, we, in this world, we have things that we can interact with. We have objects. Well, I have this bottle of water. It's a two-dimensional wrapping of plastic around a three-dimensional region, and we can put water into that three-dimensional region. But the bottles of water in their universe look more like this. It's a one-dimensional wrapping around the two-dimensional region, and we can fill that with water if we want. So water can be held inside that bottle. Here's what a house in Flatland might look like. To us, it looks just like a floor plan for a house. But for a Flatlander, this is their entire house. There are walls, they are one-dimensional, surrounding two-dimensional regions. Walls that separate the inside of the house from the outside of the house. Walls that divide the house into rooms. But there's no ceiling, there's no floor, because there's no up and down. Ceiling needs an up, floor needs a down, and they don't have those things in their universe. So this is what their entire house looks like. Now here's an image of a Flatlander coming home after a long day at work. He's standing outside of his house. He has no idea what's in his home. He can't see inside of his home because the walls are between him and the inside. So he can't see inside. He can't see the back of his house over here because the house is between him and his backyard. So he can't see any of that. But we, as three-dimensional beings, outside of this Flatland universe, we can see everything inside of his house. We can see there's no people there. We can see he's clearly a very poor person because he actually has no possessions. There's no furniture in his house. There's nothing, he owns nothing except this house. And all of his money goes to his mortgage payments. So he can't see inside, but we can see everything that goes on. So he's going to go inside of his house, and when he gets in there and he closes the door, he has privacy from everybody else in Flatland. Nobody can see the crazy things that he is doing. He has complete and utter privacy. But we can see everything he's doing. No matter where he is, he can never hide. Because we can see everything that is going on here. Does that sound familiar? Okay. Now, let's change topics for a second and pretend that instead of this being his home, pretend that this is a prison. And right now he is locked in a prison cell. He'll never be able to escape because he's got walls and a locked door on all four sides. There's no way for this guy to escape. He'll be locked in this prison cell forever. But if he could just realize that there's a third dimension, and if he could harness that third dimension and take advantage of it, he could escape from this prison easily. All he has to do is come out of the screen, into the third dimension, go south, until he's outside of the prison walls, and then go back into Flatland, and he's outside of his prison. Now, I've given you guys a great piece of advice right here, because if you ever find yourself in trouble in the future, and you're ever in prison, all you have to do is realize that there is a fourth dimension, and then take advantage of it. Enter that fourth dimension from your prison cell, go to a different area outside of the prison, and then come back into our three-dimensional universe, and you will have escaped from your prison. Pretty useful, right? Math can be useful sometimes. Okay? Now, for those of you who like to consider time as that fourth dimension, it's completely analogous to saying, if I'm locked in this prison cell, all I have to do is construct a time machine. Go back in time to before when the prison was built, walk outside where the prison wall will someday be, and then come back into the present. And I'll be outside of my prison cell. It's completely analogous. Okay? But again, we want to avoid time as that fourth dimension. We want to use spatial dimensions. Okay, so here's this flatlander. I'm a three-dimensional person. I'm outside of his universe. He has no idea that I'm there. Everything that he does, maybe he thinks that he's in privacy there, but we can see everything that this guy does. He has no way of knowing that I exist because he can't look up out of that screen. He can't turn outward from that screen and see us out here. But we can see him, and we can see everything about him. But suppose I wanted to have a relationship with these flatlanders. Suppose I wanted to get to know this guy a little better. And I want to let him know that I'm here. I can help him. I can interact with him. Well, how am I going to do this? I could go and talk to him. I could just go right up to him. I could get right up to maybe his liver or whatever is in there, and I could speak to him. My sound waves would travel into Flatland. It would sound like a voice is coming out of his belly. It would sound like a voice is coming from inside of him. Okay, that might freak him out a little bit. So I might go somewhere else, over here somewhere, project my voice into Flatland. But he still has no idea where this voice is coming from. He can hear me, but he doesn't know where it's coming from. It has no comprehensible origin. So, maybe I could tell him, well, hey, I'm a three-dimensional being. I live in the third dimension. That's why you can't see me. But that'll just confuse him anymore because every flatlander knows that there's no such thing as a third dimension. So, I say, how about I perform some miracles? I'm going to perform some miracles to prove to this guy that I exist and that the third dimension exists. So I see this bottle of water. It's got a sealed cap on it. It's never been opened. But from the third dimension, we could easily come in here, suck out all of that water, and replace it with some other thing, like wine. And we have changed water into wine. Now, if I was more like God, and I am nothing like God, but if I was more like God, and I had the ability to maybe see the molecular structure of the water, then I could simply zoom into this and rearrange the molecules to quite literally change water into wine. So, there's an explanation of a possible miracle. I continue to do things like this. There's many other miracles I can show this guy to try to convince him that I exist. Pretend our flatland friend here has a tumor. Hopefully you can see his tumor in there. It's inoperable. The flatland doctors have no way of getting rid of it. It's going to kill him eventually. Well, me, as a three-dimensional person, can easily go up there from the third dimension and just pull that tumor out without cutting through his skin, without performing some dangerous surgery. It might still be dangerous. I need to make sure I'm not pulling out part of his internal organs or his brain or something like that, but I can remove that without performing surgery on it. So now I've healed this guy. I've miraculously cured him. So he goes, he tells all of his friends, hey look, I've been healed by this higher dimensional being. I believe that this guy exists, I believe this three-dimensional or higher dimensional being exists, and he has cured me. Well, some people are going to believe him. Maybe his family and friends, the ones who know that he had this terminal illness, this tumor that was going to kill him. And they know now that he is cured, and they know he didn't have a surgery. Well, some will believe, but surely there's going to be others who doubt him. Maybe they'll say, oh, he lied. He never actually had a tumor. Or maybe, okay, he had a tumor, but there was some natural explanation for how he got healed. We just haven't figured that out yet. So I finally realized that the only way that I am going to get these people to believe that I exist is to come into their universe, to enter their world, to talk with them, to become friends with them, and to get to know these people personally. And so I make this decision that I'm going to enter their flatland universe. Now again, to make my graphics easier, I'm going to pretend that I'm a cube, and that I, as a cube, want to visit flatland. So there I am. I look just like that.
I reckon.
And I want to enter Flatland to get to know this guy. So I approach Flatland until the moment I just touch it. To that Flatlander there, a big rectangle just appeared out of nowhere. It just suddenly appeared with no warning. Now, as this thing is going to pass through the universe, all that flatlander is going to see is cross-sections of this cube. Two-dimensional cross-sections, just the part that's intersecting that flat land. Okay? Now, as he's doing this, he is certainly going to say, look, I'm witnessing something miraculous. This thing just appeared out of nowhere, and now it's talking to me. Okay, so as it passes through, it's going to see a two-dimensional cross-section, something that looks just like the flatlanders. No difference. It's looking at a cross-section of a three-dimensional object. Now, we have to keep in mind also that the flatlander just sees this one two-dimensional cross-section. But there's so much more of this cube that is still outside of that universe. There is so much more to this cube that flatlander never sees. So much more of this cube that the flatlander does not yet understand. And there is so much more that this cube can still do. Even though part of him is still in this universe, he can still interact with other parts of flatland, with the stuff that's outside of that universe. Well, eventually the cube says, okay, it's time to go away, and he passes on through and instantly just disappears into nothingness. And of course, these flatlanders are going to say, we have just witnessed something miraculous. This guy appeared out of nowhere, and then he just disappeared into thin air. There are many times in the Bible where Jesus or maybe an angel appears out of nowhere. For example, after the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, all of the disciples have locked themselves, barricaded themselves in a room where they're hiding. They've locked the doors, and there's no way into this room. But then Jesus appears among them, where he is able to talk with them, and they can feel him and see that he is real. But he appeared out of nowhere. And this happens several times in the Bible. And there are many other miracles in the Bible that can be explained with similar techniques to what we've talked about tonight, whether we're talking about creation, parting of the Red Sea, Balaam's talking donkey, water into wine, Jesus walking on water, Jesus feeding thousands of people with a few loaves of bread and fish. All of these things are explainable from a mathematical perspective. So all of these miracles that we talk about are easy for God to do as a higher dimensional being. So is there a higher dimensional being? Is there a fourth dimension? Are there more dimensions? I don't know if there are more dimensions. Mathematically, it's certainly possible. Scientifically, it's actually theorized that it is true that there are many more dimensions than the three physical ones we can see. But I don't know. It's not like we can prove it. Right? But God, if he exists, he is certainly a higher dimensional being. He is omnidimensional. And it's because of this that he is able to do all of these miracles that we read about in the Bible or hear about in the world. So, some of you might be here tonight, and maybe you don't believe in God. Maybe you don't believe that Jesus Christ is God. Well, what's stopping you from believing this? I have told you and explained to you that if God exists, certainly the miracles in the Bible can be explained mathematically, so those should not be a deterrent for believing in God. But if God can do all of these things that we talked about, what else can he do? What does it mean to us personally to know that God can do these things? Well, God can certainly, he's outside of our physical dimensions and can do these miracles that we've talked about, but he is also outside of our time dimension. He lives outside of time. He is not confined and restricted to being in time. He lives outside of our timeline. He can see all of time at all times, past, present, and future. He can see all of it, just like we can see all of flatland, just like we can overlook a timeline of historical events, but we can only see the past and the present. God can see past, present, and he knows what the future is as well. And he can enter into that timeline anywhere, anytime that he wants. No matter what time it is, past, present, or future, God simply is. As he would say it, I am. He always was. In the beginning, God. In the end, God. Jesus, at the end of the book of Matthew, the Great Commission. He doesn't say, I will be with you always. He says, I am with you always. It's not about was or will be. I am with God. And He is with us. Not only does He do this, not only does He overlook our physical and time dimensions, He overlooks our spiritual dimension, our emotional dimensions, our intelligence, our knowledge. He overlooks all of these dimensions. And He can see them as if they were right there in front of Him, just like we can see that flatland universe. He can see our happiness. He can see our joy. He can see our love. He can see our hurt, our pain, our confusion. He can see all of these things as if they are right there in front of Him. But the true power and the ultimate miracle of God is not that He can see these things and can interact with us, but He has the power to heal us. He has the power to restore us. He has the power to forgive us. He has the power to bring us under His mercy, His love, and His grace. All we have to do is allow that to happen. All we have to do is accept it. For God did not come into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world. We just have to accept it. So, God is real. And I have shown you that using mathematics, we can understand how He interacts with us. He entered our three-dimensional universe. All of this actually happened. But how do we know that God exists? How do we know that He entered our universe? And how do we know that it was Jesus Christ who did it? Well, I hope that you will come back next week to hear the evidence for why Jesus Christ is real and why we know that He actually existed. Thank you.